There are nights that arrive like any other, dressed in the ordinary fabric of routine, giving no indication that they are about to become a seam in the timeline of your life. They do not announce themselves with thunder or a sudden shift in the wind. They simply unfold, moment by quiet moment, until you find yourself standing on a threshold you never knew was there. You look back and realize the entire architecture of your world has been redrawn, its foundations shifted by a single, softly spoken sentence. For me, that night was a Tuesday in late October, when the air had finally surrendered its warmth to the coming chill, and the world outside the car was a blur of streetlights bleeding into the damp asphalt. The engine was off. The silence inside the small space was no longer comfortable, but a living thing, a presence with weight and texture, pressing in on me from all sides. He was supposed to drop me off. That was the simple, unremarkable contract of the evening. We had dinner with friends, a weekly ritual that had become one of the load-bearing walls of my social life. And now, the logical conclusion was for him to pull up to my curb, for me to say thank you, and for us to part ways until the next unremarkable event on our shared calendar. But Julian hadn't pulled up to the curb. He had parked the car a block away from my apartment building, under the anemic orange glow of a lone street lamp, and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening, a vacuum where the low rumble of the motor had been. I could hear the frantic, useless thrumming of my own heart, a trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I watched his hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. He was staring straight ahead, through the windshield at the darkened storefronts across the street, his profile a study in tension, a photograph I had taken 1,000 times in my mind, but never dared to capture with my camera. "Julian," I asked, and the sound of my own voice was strange, thin. He didn't turn to look at me, not at first. He just took a breath, a slow, deliberate inhale that seemed to draw all the remaining oxygen out of the car. It was the kind of breath one takes before diving into deep water or before confessing a crime. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough around the edges, as if it had traveled a great distance to reach me. "I can't stop thinking about your smile," and there it was. The sentence that redrew the map. It wasn't a declaration of love, not a passionate outburst. It was quieter than that, more dangerous. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the exhausted finality of a man who had been holding it back for far too long. In the sudden, profound stillness that followed, I felt the world tilt on its axis. The years of our friendship, the carefully constructed boundaries, the unspoken rules that had kept me safe and sane in my unrequited affection for him. All of it felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice cracking under an unexpected weight. He was supposed to drop me off. Instead, he had parked the car, and in doing so, had parked us both in a space between what we were and what we might become, a place from which I knew, with terrifying certainty, there was no simple way back. To understand the seismic impact of those words, you have to understand the foundation they shattered. Our friendship wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. It was a quiet architecture, assembled piece by piece over 8 years from small, shared moments and a bedrock of unspoken understanding. We met in a sophomore-level art history class, a general education requirement that neither of us was particularly passionate about. I was there because photography was my life, and I believed that to create new images, you had to understand the old ones. Julian, a pragmatist even then, was there because it fit neatly into his computer science course schedule. He was bright, loud in a way that wasn't obnoxious but simply full of life, the kind of person who seemed to collect friends effortlessly, like his personality was a form of gravity. I, on the other hand, operated on the periphery, an observer by nature and by trade. I lived behind a lens, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. I remember the first time I really saw him, not just as the guy who sat 2 rows ahead of me, but as Julian. The professor was droning on about chiaroscuro and Caravaggio paintings, and I was sketching the interplay of light and shadow on the projector screen in my notebook. Julian had turned around to ask the person next to me for a spare pen, and his eyes met mine for a fleeting second. He had this smile, not the wide, easy grin he gave everyone else, but a smaller, almost apologetic one. It was the slight upturn of his lips that caught me, a momentary crack in the confident facade that revealed something softer, something uncertain underneath. My pencil stilled on the page. In that instant, my artist's brain, the part of me that is always composing, always looking for the decisive moment, framed him. The harsh fluorescent light of the lecture hall caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the slight disarray of his dark hair, the subtle curve of that smile. It was a perfect portrait of contained energy, of a restless spirit momentarily at peace. And just like that, without any warning, I was lost. Our friendship began, as many do, out of proximity and convenience. We started studying together for exams. His methodical, logical approach to memorizing dates and artists a strange but effective counterbalance to my more intuitive, visual understanding of the material. In those late-night library sessions, fueled by bad coffee and a shared sense of academic dread, I learned the cartography of him. I learned he tapped his foot when he was concentrating, that he chewed on the end of his pens, that he had a surprisingly deep and unaffected laugh that could echo beautifully in the cavernous, silent reading room. I learned about his family in a different state, his ambition to build things that mattered, and his complicated, on-again, off-again relationship with a girl named Clara, who seemed to exist as more of an idea in his life than a tangible presence. I, in turn, remained largely a closed book. I spoke about my photography, my passion for capturing the unnoticed beauty in the mundane, but I kept the door to my inner world firmly shut. He knew the facts of my life, but not the feelings. He never knew that when he'd lean over my shoulder to look at my notes, the scent of his laundry detergent, something clean and sharp, like fresh linen and rain, would fill my senses and make it impossible to concentrate. He never knew that I kept the clumsy sketches I made of him in that lecture hall, hidden away in a portfolio like secret, precious documents. He saw a friend, a reliable, quiet study partner. I saw the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit, content just to feel the warmth, terrified of getting any closer, of being consumed by the fire. My feelings for him became a room inside myself that I never entered when he was around, a place I kept locked and soundproofed. It was the only way to preserve the friendship that had quickly become the most important thing in my life. After college, we both ended up staying in the city. He took a demanding job as a software engineer at a startup, pouring his restless energy into lines of code, while I scraped by, taking whatever freelance photography gigs I could find: weddings, corporate headshots, product catalogs, all while working on my personal projects in the stolen hours of the early morning. Our lives were divergent, yet our friendship deepened, settling into a comfortable, essential rhythm. We had Tuesday night dinners with our small, overlapping group of friends. We had Saturday afternoons spent in comfortable silence in my apartment, me editing photos on my laptop, him decompressing from his week, sprawled on my worn-out sofa, reading or scrolling through his phone. He was the one constant in the shifting landscape of my postgraduate life, a fixed point of reference. He was my best friend, and for years, that was enough. It had to be. I watched him move through relationships, always with a kind of detached sympathy. His dynamic with Clara continued for years, a cycle of breakups and reconciliations that seemed to cause him more exhaustion than joy. I was his confidant during the low points, the person he would call after a fight. I would listen, offer carefully neutral advice, and feel a toxic cocktail of emotions churning inside me. Guilt for the small, treacherous part of me that felt a flicker of hope whenever they were on the verge of ending it for good. Shame for that guilt, and an overarching, profound ache for his sadness. I became an expert at emotional compartmentalization. I could be the supportive friend, the sturdy shoulder, while simultaneously locking away the screaming, hopeful traitor in my heart. The room inside me where I kept my love for him grew larger, its walls thicker. I furnished it with memories, with stolen glances and casual touches that meant the world to me and nothing to him. It was a lonely, beautiful, painful place, but it was mine. And it kept the friendship, the real, tangible thing I had with him, safe. So when he sat in the car that October night and spoke of my smile, it was not just a compliment. It was a key turning in the lock of that hidden room. It was a direct acknowledgement of the one thing I had worked so hard to keep from him, that my smile, when directed at him, was different. It was the one unguarded part of me, a crack in my own facade. It was the unconscious admission of everything I felt. For him to not only notice it, but to confess that it occupied his thoughts, was to tell me that he had, on some level, been looking at me just as closely as I had been looking at him. And that realization was more terrifying and more exhilarating than anything I had ever felt in my life. The architecture was collapsing, and I had no idea what, if anything, would be left standing in its place. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic slide. It began about 6 months before that night in the car. It began, as so many of our pivotal moments did, with Clara. This time, the breakup was final. There was no dramatic fight, no shouting match. It was a quiet, mutual surrender to the fact that they were two people who loved the idea of each other more than the reality. Julien delivered the news to me on my sofa, staring at the ceiling as if the words were written there. He spoke with a strange lack of emotion, a clinical detachment that I knew was a defense mechanism, a dam holding back a flood. He wasn't heartbroken in the traditional sense, he was unmoored. For nearly a decade, Clara had been his narrative, the story he told himself about his romantic life. Without her, he was adrift, the plot of his own life suddenly gone. In the weeks that followed, he began to spend more and more time at my apartment. It started innocently enough. He'd text after work, asking if I was home, and show up with takeout, claiming he didn't want to eat alone in his sterile, empty apartment that still bore the faint ghost of her presence. I never said no. My small, cluttered apartment, filled with stacks of photography books, drying prints hanging from clothespins, and the faint, chemical scent of darkroom fixer, became his sanctuary. He'd sink into the deep cushions of my sofa, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders, and he would just be. He didn't always need to talk. Sometimes, we would just exist in the same space, the silence punctuated by the click of my keyboard or the turning of a page in his book. It was a new kind of quiet between us, heavier than before, filled with the things he wasn't saying. I found myself studying him more intently than ever, cataloging the subtle signs of his distress. The new shadows under his eyes, the way he'd rub the back of his neck when he thought I wasn't looking, the forced brightness in his voice when our friends asked how he was doing. He was a ship taking on water, trying desperately to project an image of seaworthiness. I wanted to reach out, to plug the holes, to tell him that it was okay to sink a little, that I would be his harbor. But I didn't. I just kept the lights on for him, made sure there was coffee, and offered the silent, steady presence I knew how to give. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. It was a necessary lie, a flimsy shield against the truth, that every moment he chose to spend in my space, seeking my quiet company over anyone else's, felt like a victory. It was a selfish, shameful feeling, and I buried it deep. The first time he stayed the night, it was almost an accident. We'd been watching an old black and white film, a moody noir that I loved and he pretended to tolerate. A storm had rolled in, a sudden, violent downpour that lashed against my windows. By the time the credits rolled, it was after 2 in the morning, and the rain was relentless. I should go, he said, but he made no move to get up. He was slumped against the arm of the sofa, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Don't be an idiot, I said, my voice softer than I intended. You can't drive in this. Just crash here. It was a simple offer, a logical solution. But the words hung in the air between us, charged with a significance that felt disproportionate to their meaning. He looked at me, his gaze searching, and for a heartbeat, I thought he would refuse. Then he nodded, a small, grateful dip of his chin. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Leo. I set him up with blankets and a pillow on the sofa, the same way I would for any friend. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, and stood in the darkness, listening. I could hear the rustle of fabric as he settled in, the soft sigh he let out as he finally surrendered to sleep. The sound traveled through the thin wall, through the closed door, and embedded itself in my chest. He was on the other side of a single piece of wood, sleeping in my home, vulnerable and present. It felt like a monumental event, a crossing of some invisible line. The storm outside raged, but inside my apartment, a new kind of weather system was forming, one of quiet intensity and unpredictable currents. I lay awake for hours, listening to the rain and the sound of his steady breathing, feeling the geography of my own world changing, island by island, shore by shore. That one night became a ritual. It was a slow, insidious creep, a boundary dissolving so gradually I could almost pretend it wasn't happening. It was no longer just on stormy nights or after late movies. It became an unspoken assumption. After our Tuesday dinners, he would drive us back to my place. He'd follow me up the stairs, shed his jacket, and collapse onto the sofa as if it were his own. There was always a pretext, a plausible deniability that we both clung to like a life raft. "My place is just so quiet," he'd say, or, "I sleep better here." I never questioned it. I never pushed. I just accepted his presence, this constant, wonderful, agonizing proximity. My apartment, once my solitary refuge, was now our shared space. His toothbrush appeared in my bathroom holder. A spare hoodie of his was permanently draped over my armchair. These small invasions of his life into mine were like tiny flags planted on conquered territory, and I was a willing, silent subject. The sofa was the first frontier. For weeks, he slept there. I would wake up in the morning and find him tangled in the blankets, his hair a mess, his face soft and unguarded in the morning light. I'd move around him quietly, making coffee, the aroma filling the small apartment. These were my favorite moments. In the stillness of the early morning, before the city was fully awake, I could look at him without fear of my expression betraying me. I could study the line of his jaw, the gentle flutter of his eyelids, and allow myself to feel the full, crushing weight of my affection for him. It was a form of worship, my own private matins. He was a masterpiece of slumbering masculinity, and I was the sole patron of the gallery. Then he would stir, his eyes would blink open, and he'd give me a sleepy, crooked smile that would send a jolt straight to my core. "Morning," he'd murmur, his voice thick with sleep, and I would have to turn away, retreating behind the shield of my coffee mug, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then, the ritual evolved. One night, we were watching a movie on my laptop, huddled together on the sofa for warmth, a large fleece blanket thrown over both of us. It was a chilly evening, and the old building's heating was temperamental. He had fallen asleep halfway through, his head gradually slumping until it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I sat there, hardly daring to breathe, every nerve ending screaming with awareness of the solid, warm weight of him against me. I could feel the soft tickle of his hair against my neck, the faint, rhythmic puff of his breath against my skin. The movie played on, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls, but I didn't see it. My entire universe had contracted to that single point of contact. It was exquisite torture. I was a landscape photographer suddenly forced to shoot a macro subject, every detail magnified, overwhelming, and terrifyingly beautiful. I wanted to stay in that moment forever, and I wanted to flee from it. When the movie ended, I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat in the darkness, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating his sleeping face. An hour passed, then two. My shoulder ached, my leg had gone numb, but the discomfort was a small price to pay for this stolen intimacy. Finally, I knew I had to move. I gently tried to shift him, to ease his head onto a cushion, but he stirred, mumbling something incoherent. His arm, which had been resting between us, snaked around my waist, pulling me closer in his sleep. And that was it. My carefully constructed defenses crumbled to dust. It was an unconscious act, a reflex born of seeking comfort, but to me, it felt like a choice. He was holding on to me. With painstaking slowness, I managed to extricate myself and get to my feet. He barely moved. I looked down at him, a mess of limbs and blankets on my too small sofa. I thought about the spare mattress I had stored in a closet, about the logistics of creating a more comfortable space for him. And then a different thought, a wild, dangerous, and utterly compelling one, entered my mind. My bed was a queen. It was large enough for two. It would be a simple act of kindness, of practicality. He was my best friend, and he was uncomfortable. That's all it was. I repeated the rationalization to myself like a mantra, a desperate prayer to ward off the truth. "Julian," I whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. "Hey, come on. You'll kill your back on this thing." He blinked his eyes open, confused and disoriented. "Leo? What time is it?" "Late," I said, keeping my voice even. "Just come on. You can take the bed." "No, man, it's your bed. I'm fine here," he mumbled, already starting to drift off again. "We can share," I heard myself say, the words leaving my mouth before my brain could veto them. "It's big enough. It's stupid for you to sleep on the couch." He looked at me then, his eyes clearing for a moment. He seemed to be processing the offer, weighing it. I held my breath. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. I expected him to refuse, to laugh it off, to reestablish the boundary I had just so recklessly blurred. But instead, he just nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, the words soft with sleep. He let me help him up, and he stumbled after me into my bedroom like a sleepwalker. He collapsed onto the far side of the mattress without even taking off his t-shirt and jeans, and was asleep again almost instantly. I stood there for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest in the dim light filtering in from the street. Then, moving as if through water, I went around to the other side and slid under the covers. I lay on my back, ramrod straight, my muscles coiled with tension, staring at the ceiling. He was there, in my bed. The air was thick with his presence, his scent, the warmth radiating from his body just a few inches from mine. Sleep felt like an impossible dream. This was the new ritual, and it was going to destroy me. The bed became the new territory, a landscape of unspoken rules and breathtaking proximity. The first few nights were a study in feigned nonchalance and hypervigilant self-control. We would lie on our respective sides of the mattress, a carefully maintained channel of empty space between us, a no-man's land of sheets and blankets. We were two continents on the same planet, aware of each other's mass and pull, but maintaining a strict, continental divide. I would lie awake for hours, my back to him, listening to his breathing deepen into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. Every shift of his weight on the mattress, every rustle of the covers, was a seismic event that registered on the Richter scale of my nervous system. I was acutely aware of the heat his body generated, a warmth that seemed to call to the cold, lonely parts of me. It was a nightly exercise in sensory overload and monastic discipline. I, the photographer, the professional observer, found myself documenting this new reality in excruciating detail in my mind. I learned the subtle symphony of his sleep sounds, the soft sigh he'd let out just as he was drifting off, the occasional, quiet snore if he was on his back, the way he'd sometimes mumble a single, indecipherable word into his pillow. I learned the shape of his sleeping form under the duvet, the curve of his spine, the broad expanse of his shoulders. My bedroom, my most private space, had been transformed. It was no longer just mine. It was a shared habitat, and I was a naturalist studying a rare and beautiful creature that had wandered into my territory, terrified that any sudden move would cause it to bolt. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the geography of the bed began to change. The channel between us narrowed. It started with a foot accidentally brushing against mine in the night, a jolt of electricity that would leave me wide awake, my heart pounding. Then, one morning, I woke up to find that he had rolled over in his sleep, his arm thrown across my chest, his face buried in the crook of my neck. I froze, my body turning to stone. His breath was warm against my skin, his scent, that clean, familiar smell, now mingled with the musk of sleep, was intoxicating. I lay there, trapped and liberated all at once, in a state of suspended animation. It was the realization of 1,000 secret fantasies, and it was happening under the guise of an unconscious accident. I didn't dare move a muscle, memorizing the weight of his arm, the texture of his hair against my cheek, the profound, simple intimacy of the moment. I waited until his breathing changed, a sign he was beginning to stir, and then, with the stealth of a spy, I slipped out from under his arm and out of the bed before he could wake up and find us like that. This became the new pattern. He was a restless sleeper, a seeker of warmth, and more often than not, I would wake up to find some part of him connected to me. An arm, a leg, sometimes his entire body curled against my back, his front pressed against me like a second skin. He was the initiator, but only in his sleep. His unconscious body was doing what his conscious mind would not, or could not, allow. And my conscious mind was in turmoil. Part of me lived for these moments, hoarding them like precious jewels. They were a balm to the deep, aching loneliness I had carried for so long. But another part of me was screaming in protest. It was a cruel kind of hope, a false intimacy built on a foundation of plausible deniability. In the morning, he would wake up on his side of the bed, oblivious, and smile at me over coffee, and I would have to pretend that I hadn't spent the night as his human hot water bottle, my body alight with a forbidden fire. The open door became another part of the ritual. My bedroom door, which I had always kept closed at night, now remained permanently ajar. It was an unspoken invitation, a symbol of the blurred boundaries of our lives. He would come in late, after I was already in bed reading, and he wouldn't knock. He would just appear in the doorway, a silhouette against the brighter light of the living room, and whisper, "Hey, you awake?" And I always was. He would pad into the room, his movements familiar and sure in the darkness, and the bed would dip with his weight. We would talk, our voices low, about his day at work, about a movie I had seen, about nothing at all. These were the conversations that happened only in the dark, in the confessional space of the shared bed. He was more open, more vulnerable, in those late-night whispers. He spoke of his anxieties about his job, his feeling of being adrift without the structure of his relationship with Clara, his fear that he was falling behind in life. "It's just, everything feels so quiet now," he confessed one night, his voice barely audible over the distant city sounds. "My apartment is like a museum of a life I used to have. Here, it's different. It's not quiet. It's peaceful." His words were a gut punch. He felt peace here, with me. The distinction he drew between quiet and peaceful was everything. Quiet was emptiness. Peace was a comfortable, living stillness. He found that in my home, in my bed. The knowledge was both a comfort and a torment. I was his sanctuary, his safe harbor from the storm of his own life. But what was he to me? He was the storm itself, a beautiful, chaotic weather system that had taken over my climate, and I was just learning to navigate the turbulent waters, praying I wouldn't capsize. The ritual was a slow, beautiful dance on the edge of a cliff. Every night, we moved closer to the edge. I didn't know if he was aware of the drop below us, but I was. I saw it every time I closed my eyes. And I was terrified of the fall, but even more terrified of stepping back. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was a day like any other, which is how the most important days always begin. Julian had a brutal week at work, a project deadline was looming, and he'd been running on caffeine and stress. He came over straight from the office, looking utterly depleted. He didn't even make it to the sofa, just dropped his messenger bag by the door, kicked off his shoes, and headed straight for my bedroom. I was at my desk, editing a set of photos, the soft click of my mouse the only sound in the room. He walked past me without a word and fell face down onto the bed, burying his face in my pillow. He let out a long, weary groan that seemed to carry the weight of the entire week. I swiveled in my chair to look at him. His body, even in exhaustion, was a tense line of coiled energy. "Rough day?" I asked, the question feeling laughably inadequate. He answered without lifting his head, his voice muffled by the bedding. "Rough century." I got up and walked over to the bed, sitting on the edge near his feet. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering in the air. Then I placed it on his back, between his shoulder blades. I intended it as a simple, comforting gesture, the kind one friend offers another. But the moment my palm made contact with the warm, solid muscle through the thin fabric of his shirt, the air in the room changed. It thickened, became charged. I could feel the tension in him under my hand, but I could also feel him subtly lean into the touch, a near imperceptible yielding. I didn't pull away. I just left my hand there, a silent anchor. We stayed like that for a long time, in a silence that was deeper and more potent than any we had shared before. It wasn't peaceful. It was electric. It was the stillness before a lightning strike. I could feel my own pulse, a heavy, rhythmic beat, in my fingertips, right where they touched his back. I was sure he could feel it too. He finally rolled over, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was lying on his back, looking up at me. His eyes were dark and unreadable, his expression one I had never seen on him before. It was a raw, unguarded look, stripped of all his usual easygoing charm. It was the look of a man standing on a precipice. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Yeah." I managed my own voice tight. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just held my gaze. I watched as his eyes flickered down to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. My breath hitched in my throat. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient sounds of the city fading into a distant hum. There was only the space between us, shrinking with every heartbeat. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, and the question was so quiet, so fragile, I wasn't sure I had heard it correctly. "Would what be okay?" I asked, though I knew. Oh, I knew. I just needed to hear him say it. I needed the certainty, the confirmation that I wasn't imagining this, that I wasn't projecting my own years of longing onto this moment. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, bringing his face closer to mine. The scent of him, his cologne, faded after a long day, mixed with the simple scent of his skin, filled my head. "If I kissed you," he said, the words a final, terrifying, beautiful confession. "Would that be okay?" My heart stopped. Or maybe it started beating for the first time. I couldn't tell. All the years of carefully guarded feelings, of silent observation, of disciplined friendship, all of it rushed to the surface. The fear was immense, a cold wave of panic that threatened to drown me. This was the moment, the point of no return. Saying yes would change everything, irrevocably. Saying no would preserve the fragile peace, but it would be a lie, a betrayal of this terrifying, honest thing that was unfolding between us. I looked into his eyes, and I saw my own fear reflected there, but underneath it, I saw a desperate, sincere plea. He wasn't being reckless. He was being brave. He was handing me all the power, offering me the choice, respecting me enough to let me say no. And in that moment, my fear was eclipsed by a wave of love so powerful it left me breathless. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded. A single, small, shaky nod. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, his movement hesitant, giving me one last chance to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway. His lips were soft, uncertain at first, a gentle press against mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a sigh of relief. It was years of unspoken things finally finding a language. I felt a tremor run through his body, or maybe it was mine. I brought my hand up to his cheek, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his jaw, and he leaned into my touch, a soft sound escaping his throat. The kiss deepened, still gentle, still tender, but with a new certainty. It was a discovery, a mapping of new terrain. It tasted of coffee and exhaustion and a profound, bone-deep longing. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. The silence that followed wasn't empty or awkward. It was full. It was the quiet after the storm, the air clean and charged and new. The line had been crossed. We were on the other side, and I had no idea what to do next. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had secretly hoped for, but a slow, confusing fog. In the immediate moments after the kiss, there was a sense of fragile wonder. We didn't talk. We just lay there, side by side on the bed, my hand still on his cheek, his breath warm against my skin. It felt as though we had created a delicate, glass-blown bubble around us, and any sudden movement, any word, might shatter it. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and we fell asleep, not curled together in the unconscious intimacy of previous nights, but carefully, intentionally, with his hand loosely holding mine over the space between us. It was a conscious connection, a deliberate tether, and it felt more significant than all the accidental cuddling combined. I drifted off feeling a tentative, trembling hope, a belief that we had finally arrived somewhere real. I was wrong. I woke the next morning to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold, the indentation of his body on the mattress already fading. For a panicked moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. Then I saw his messenger bag was gone from its spot by the door. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, began to pool in my stomach. I found a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled on a torn piece of paper towel in his familiar, messy handwriting. Had to get in early for a meeting. See you Tuesday, that was it. No mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the monumental shift that had occurred between us. Just a sterile, procedural message that could have been written on any other day of any other week. See you Tuesday. It was a retreat to the familiar, a desperate leap back to the safety of our established routine, and it felt like a slap in the face. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. My phone, which usually buzzed with his random texts, memes, complaints about his code, questions about dinner plans, was silent. My apartment felt cavernous, haunted by his absence. Every corner held a memory of him. The sofa where he used to sleep, the armchair with his phantom hoodie, the bed that now felt impossibly, achingly large. The peace he had claimed to find here was gone, replaced by a tense, humming emptiness. I cycled through a frantic carousel of emotions. First, confusion. Had I misread everything? Was the kiss a mistake? A momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress and exhaustion on his part? Then came anger, a hot, bitter wave of it. How could he do this? How could he initiate something so profound and then just vanish, leaving me to grapple with the emotional wreckage alone? And finally, inevitably, came the crushing weight of self-doubt and heartbreak. I had allowed myself to hope. I had let him into that locked room inside my heart, and he had simply walked out, leaving the door swinging wide open, exposing everything to the cold. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it like a photograph, searching for clues I might have missed. The hesitation in his voice when he asked, the vulnerability in his eyes, the tremor that ran through him when our lips met. It had all felt so real, so honest. Had I imagined it? Was my own longing so powerful that it had colored the entire event, transforming a moment of weakness on his part into a grand romantic confession on mine? The quiet observer had finally become a participant, and it seemed I had failed spectacularly, misinterpreting the most crucial piece of data. The thought was humiliating. I felt raw, exposed, and profoundly stupid. I dreaded Tuesday, the day of our standing dinner with friends. The thought of seeing him, of having to pretend that nothing had happened, that my world hadn't been cracked down the middle, was unbearable. I considered canceling, feigning sickness, but I knew it would be a coward's way out. I had to face him. I had to know. When Tuesday arrived, I felt sick with anxiety. I walked into the restaurant and saw him already there, sitting with our friends, laughing at something someone had said. He looked up as I approached, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Panic, guilt. I couldn't be sure, before it was replaced by his usual easy smile. Leo, there he is, he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. It was a performance. The rest of the dinner was torture. He avoided my gaze, directing his conversation to everyone but me. He was animated, charming, the Julian everyone knew and loved. But I could see the cracks. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept fiddling with his fork, the slight tremor in his hand when he lifted his water glass. He was hiding, and he was doing it in plain sight. After dinner, as our friends started to disperse, the moment I had been dreading arrived. We were left standing on the sidewalk, the two of us, under the buzz of a neon sign. The air was thick with unspoken words. I can give you a ride, he offered, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. No, I said. and the word came out sharper than I intended. He finally looked at me, his expression startled. We need to talk, Julian. Not in the car. Not on the way to somewhere else. Now, a look of profound weariness settled over his features. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Leo, I'm really tired. Can we not do this tonight? No, we can't not do this tonight, I insisted, a desperate courage rising in me. I was not going to let him run away again. What happened on Thursday? What was that? And what is this? This pretending I don't exist. My voice cracked on the last few words, the hurt I had been suppressing for days finally breaking through. He winced, the sound of my pain a physical blow. He finally deflated, the performative energy draining out of him, leaving him looking smaller, younger, and incredibly lost. He gestured vaguely down the street. Let's walk. We walked in silence for a few blocks, the distance between us on the pavement feeling like a chasm. He finally stopped in the middle of a deserted park, leaning against the railing of a small bridge that overlooked a dark, still pond. He stared down into the black water for a long time before he spoke. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words swallowed by the night air. Leo, I am so sorry. I freaked out. I shouldn't have run. It was a shitty thing to do. Why, Julian? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Why did you freak out? Was it a mistake? Just tell me the truth. I can take it. I just need to know what's real. He finally turned to face me, and in the dim park lighting, I could see the glistening track of a tear on his cheek. The sight of it broke my heart. That's the problem, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It felt too real. It wasn't a mistake. That's what scared me. He took a shaky breath, struggling to find the words. All my life, things have been prescribed. Go to college, get the degree, get the job, have the girlfriend. Clara was part of that plan. It was comfortable. It was what I was supposed to do. When that ended, I was lost. And I came to you, to your place, because it was the only place that felt solid. Safe. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. And then it started to change. Being there with you, it wasn't just safe anymore. It was necessary. I started needing it. Needing you. And I didn't understand it. I didn't have a category for it. You were my best friend. That was the box you were in. But the feeling was spilling out of the box, and it terrified me. He gestured helplessly with his hands. That night, kissing you, it wasn't a thought-out decision. It was an instinct. It was like I had been holding my breath for months, and I finally had to exhale. And it was good. It was better than good. And that's why I ran. Because something that felt that good, that right, couldn't possibly fit into the life I thought I was supposed to have. It meant everything had to change. And I'm a coward. He finally ran out of words, his confession hanging in the cold night air between us. He looked utterly broken, his carefully constructed world in ruins around him. All my anger, all my hurt, evaporated, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a version of himself he was terrified to become. He was just as lost in this as I was. I closed the distance between us, stepping forward until I was standing right in front of him. I reached out and wiped the tear from his cheek with my thumb. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. You're not a coward, I said softly. You're just human. And you're scared. I get it. I'm scared too. What are we doing, Leo? He asked, his voice a raw whisper. I looked into his lost, beautiful eyes, and for the first time, the answer felt simple. All the overanalysis, all the fear, all the years of pining, it all distilled down to a single, undeniable truth. I don't know, I said honestly. But whatever it is, I think we have to do it together. No more running. I let my hand cup his jaw, holding him steady, holding him there with me. Okay. He stared at me for a long moment, a battle of fear and hope raging in his eyes. Then, slowly he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. It was a start. He leaned in and rested his forehead against mine again, just as he had after the kiss. This time, it wasn't an act of retreat or confusion. It was an act of surrender. We stood there for a long time, two people on a dark bridge, having finally found our way back to the same shore. The fog was beginning to lift. The conversation on the bridge was not a magical fix. It was a beginning, the painful but necessary act of setting a dislocated bone. The healing process was slow, tentative, and required a new kind of patience from both of us. There was no sudden, cinematic rush into a new relationship. Instead, we entered a period of careful, intentional reconstruction. We had to dismantle the old architecture of our friendship, examine each piece, and decide how it fit into the new structure we were trying to build. It was quiet work, done in the language we knew best: shared space, small gestures, and a gradual, deliberate honesty. He didn't stay over that night. We walked back to his car, and I let him drive me home. The silence in the car was different this time. It wasn't the screaming, tense vacuum of the week before. It was a pensive quiet, a space for thought. When he pulled up in front of my building, he didn't park a block away. He stopped right at the curb. He turned to me, and the uncertainty was still there in his eyes, but it was no longer shadowed by panic. It was just question. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a promise made out of obligation, but a simple statement of intent. I believed him. I nodded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I gave him a real smile. A small one, but genuine. I saw his shoulders relax, a subtle release of the tension he had been carrying all night. I got out of the car and didn't look back, trusting that he would do what he said. He did. The next day, my phone buzzed. It was a text from him. Coffee. Just that. We met at a small cafe halfway between our apartments, a neutral ground. We talked for hours. We didn't talk about the kiss, or about feelings, or about what we were now. We talked about everything else. About his project at work, about a new photography series I was planning, about a stupid movie we had both seen. We were relearning how to be with each other, how to speak to each other, now that the massive, unspoken thing that had lived between us for so long was finally out in the open. It was awkward at times, like trying on a new pair of shoes, but it was also a relief. The foundation was shaky, but we were laying it again, brick by brick. He started staying over again a week later. But the ritual had changed. He didn't just show up. He would ask, "Is it okay if I come over tonight?" He'd text, the question a mark of respect for my space, for my feelings. And when he came, it was different. The plausible deniability was gone, stripped away. We were both acutely aware of why he was there. He wasn't just escaping his empty apartment anymore. He was coming toward me. The first night he stayed, we lay in my bed on our separate sides, the channel between us wide and deliberate. But this time, it wasn't a space of fear. It was a space of respect. Near midnight, in the darkness, he spoke. "Can I hold your hand?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yes," I whispered back. His hand found mine in the darkness, his fingers lacing through mine. The contact was simple, chaste, and more intimate than any of the accidental, sleepy embraces we had shared before. It was a choice. We were choosing this. We fell asleep like that, tethered together in the quiet dark. Slowly, the new normal began to take shape. It was a life built in the quiet moments. It was him cooking dinner in my kitchen, his movements surprisingly confident as he chopped vegetables, while I sat at the table, just watching him, feeling a sense of profound, peaceful rightness. It was me showing him how to develop a print in my makeshift darkroom, the red safe light casting us in a warm, otherworldly glow, our hands brushing in the chemical bath. He was fascinated by the process, by the way an image could slowly emerge from a blank sheet of paper, a ghost becoming solid. "It's like magic," he'd said, and I thought about us, about how we were slowly, carefully, emerging from the darkness, becoming something real and visible. The metaphor was so perfect it almost hurt. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was built on consent and communication. Kisses were no longer a shocking, earth-shattering event, but a new part of our vocabulary. They were soft goodnight kisses, quick, affectionate pecks in the kitchen while waiting for the coffee to brew, longer, deeper explorations when the feeling was right. Every touch was intentional. When we slept, he would ask, "Can I be close to you?" before wrapping an arm around me, pulling my back against his chest. And I would relax into his warmth, no longer on high alert, no longer afraid of what it meant. It meant he wanted to be close to me. It was as simple and as miraculous as that. The bedroom door, once left ajar as a symbol of ambiguity, was now closed every night. Not to shut the world out, but to keep our world in. It was our space now, private and defined. We didn't need the ambiguity of an open door anymore. We had certainty instead. One rainy Saturday afternoon, months later, we were lying on the sofa, tangled up together under a blanket, reading. It was a scene that looked almost identical to 100 other moments from our past, but the internal landscape was entirely different. I was no longer a man in silent torment, but a man at peace. I looked over at him, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read his book, his head resting comfortably in my lap. I reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair off his forehead. He looked up from his book, his eyes soft. He didn't say anything. He just smiled at me. It wasn't his big, public grin or the small, apologetic smile from the lecture hall all those years ago. It was a new smile, a quiet, knowing, deeply content smile that was just for me. And I realized that he wasn't the only one whose smile had meaning. Mine did too. It was a reflection of his, a mirror of the quiet, profound happiness I had found in this unexpected, beautiful place we had built together. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and there are words that, once spoken, permanently alter the landscape of your memory. The night Julian parked the car and confessed that he couldn't stop thinking about my smile was a fault line, a moment that separated my life into a before and an after. The after was not a simple, easy paradise. It was a terrain we had to navigate together, full of its own challenges and uncertainties. But it was real. We had traded the comfortable, lonely safety of our friendship for the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of something more. We had been two separate territories with a carefully guarded border, and now the border was gone. We had become a new country, learning to speak a new language, drawing a new map, day by day. We began to heal, not just from the fallout of our own unspoken history, but from the older, deeper wounds we both carried, in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally, painstakingly, learned to create together.